Hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of Stiglr for the Details. My name is Alan Dickerson, otherwise known as Stiglr Online, and I'm doing this stream in reaction to a comment that I saw on YouTube from about a year ago from a fellow who signed in as Happy Feet, specifically requesting a tutorial on GBACW movement and even more specifically reaction movement. So I thought I would kind of weigh in on movement and define some things that it is and what it is not, and illustrate it with some examples from uh, the games themselves. So without further ado, going to enlarge this. And let's first talk about movement, what movement is, and even more specifically, what movement is not. So, there are a lot of ways that you can change the position of one of your units in Great Battles of the American Civil War, both when you are phasing, that is, you're the attacking or active player, and when you are non phasing, or basically the other side when the activated side is moving. Movement, for our purposes, is defined as a voluntary change in position of an activated unit. That's probably the best way to put it, because amidst all of that legalese are some things that might constitute movement in many people's minds, but actually are not movement. And we will get into that pretty soon after I kind of flesh out exactly what movement is in the parlance of this system. So, movement is characterized by A being the active player. So, as you know from other tutorials in the series, the action in the game revolves around one player drawing or earning an activation and being able to move some of his units, some of the units under his command. And then you draw a chit to see who the next formation is that will move. And then that uh, unit is activated. The other side is the non-active player, and they can do a limited amount of things in reaction to what the active player is doing, but movement is not one of them. So let's define what movement is. Let's say that the Union has activated. Specifically, we'll say that Moore's division has activated. When his chit is drawn from the cup, all of the units under his command, that is basically bearing the pink banner, and let me zoom in a little bit so you can see more clearly. The units with the pink banners on the top are subordinate to Moore's division. And as you can see, Moore is also serving as a brigadier for this game. And so he has a little yellow colored bar underneath him, which stands for Moore's Brigade, which is the yellow brigade. And all these units here that have little yellow dots here under their cohesion ratings are a part of that brigade. So this unit is in a different brigade than these two, but they are all in the same division. So when the Moore division is activated, you will usually move and activate and move one brigade at a time. You can sometimes coordinate them, but most of the time you will move each brigade within a division uh, sequentially, one after the other. And during that activation, each brigade will move, fire, and rally, resupply ammunition, do a number of those things, and they can also, at the end of all movement and other actions, conduct shock attacks. Then the next brigade is activated, and they do the same thing. So it's broken up that way for a reason. So movement is categorized by voluntary, that is not coerced or forced, say by uh, combat actions. It is voluntary movement by the phasing player, the active player. So when this brigade moves this, it's voluntary movement forward, and that is categorized as movement. That is actually movement in the strictest sense. Okay, now let's talk. Oh, and also during movement, there can be facing changes, and there are other rules for facing changes. Facing is not strictly movement, it is facing, but it can happen during the course of movement. Basically, the rules say that you can freely um, change your facing by one vertex for every hex you move in, and also you can begin your movement. Let's do that again. You can begin your movement with a facing change, and then you can start to move. So those are all options. And of course, the one wild card in that is the proximity or lack of proximity of enemy units. When you are not in the proximity of enemy units, you can freely move and face as you see fit. When enemy units are present, that begins to complicate things. So if you are in or enter the frontal fire zones of an enemy unit, which would be 1126 and 1226 here, all of a sudden your options change. So if this unit is, say, starting out here, he's under attack orders, which means he may move adjacent to enemy units. If he moves here, he could freely change his facing there, then move 2. He could even change his facing there if he wanted to, and then move there. Once he enters this hex adjacent to the enemy, he must stop and cannot then subsequently say, oh, let me face this way so that I can fire. You can't do that. Once you hit that enemy zone, you are stopped. Also, if you begin your movement, say here, if you begin your movement in an enemy zone, you can get a free one vertex change of direction, ostensibly to set up for a shock or to fire. But that's it. You're limited to one. If you are moving freely, you can move more than one vertex at the cost of one movement point for anything more than the one free vertex change that you make. So to make that a little clearer, let's see here. Let's count movement points here. Let's now assume that this unit is under advance orders and has all 6 of his movement allowance. He could start here, get a free direction change here. That would be free, so that's 0. Then he could move here for 1. Then he could change direction again, free, because it was only one vertex. Then that would be 2. Then say he changes his mind and decides to kind of about face. That's free. That's movement point number 3. That's also movement point number 3. And then he could go 4. Then let's say this stream costs 1 to go across the hex side, and then 6 to enter that hex. So that's a combination of facing and movement. Okay, let's move him back here. Let's move him back down here. Now, let's say he is under attack orders, which means he can move adjacent to an enemy unit and moves here. He can then change his facing. Once he moves there, he's stuck and cannot get that free facing change to move that way. He would have to set it up so that he would enter the hex maybe from here, so that if he were to be back here and his facing's that way, if he wants to fire or not be in a position to be flanked, he would have to set it up in his earlier movement to be end up here, so that when he enters that hex in an enemy fire zone, he is also facing that enemy. So those are some of the things you have to keep track of when you are moving. Now, that is movement as characterized by a voluntary change in position of an activated unit. Let's now talk about what movement is not, even though it sometimes ends up in a sentence by saying blah, blah, blah movement. Okay, let's talk about withdrawal movement. Let's say a unit starts his activation next to an enemy unit and decides, well, it's time to get out of dodge. Okay, there are a number of things that he can do to try and get free of the enemy unit in front of him. One might be, let's say this unit is disordered. He's already disordered. What he might try to do is fire at that unit, and if he can cause another disorder or a loss, drive that unit off, make it retreat so that it is no longer adjacent. And now, if he is under attack orders, which means he can both move and fire, then he can change direction, move out, do whatever he wants. If he were under advance orders, then you can only move or fire, not both. So in the case that he fires and moves that unit back, he does free himself from the enemy zone, but because he fired and is under advance orders, the only quote unquote movement he could make would be to advance as the enemy retreated. But then again, that creates the same condition he was trying to free himself from in the first place. If the unit is under attack orders and he can move up to half of his movement allowance, but he can both move and fire in any order he chooses, he could fire at that unit, force it to retreat, not advance, and then he can, say, change his facing more than one vertex. That would cost 1 movement point because he moved or changed facing 2 vertices, and then move here for 2, maybe move there, 3, get a free facing change at the end. He could do that if he wanted to. Okay. Now, if we start our activation where the 2 units are facing each other, each in the frontal fire zone of the enemy unit, the other thing that a activated or phasing unit can do to free itself is to use withdrawal movement. Technically not movement, but withdrawal movement. And what that means is when you start in a enemy unit's frontal zone, you can declare you are using withdrawal movement, and then you can move 1 or 2 hexes through your rear, whereas movement is actually defined as you're always moving through one of your 2 frontal hexes. For withdrawal movement, you move through your rear hexes and you cannot change facing. So basically you're backpedaling in a fairly straight line. So you could go here or you could go there, but you could not go there. Your option is 1 or 2 hexes, which has to be declared when you undertake the movement. And if any of the hexes that you're going to back into cost more than 1 movement point by dint of, say, having a stream behind you here, or say having woods in back of you here, or one of these gullies intervening, which creates a +1 hex side movement cost, which would make moving from 1620 to 1619 cost 2 movement points. In any of those conditions where any of the hexes you planned to withdraw into cost more than 1, then things get complicated. So you state what you want to try to do. Then, seeing as you are retreating from an enemy fire zone, they can fire withdrawal fire at you if they choose to. It's up to them. If they fire and the result is no effect, in other words, you pass your UDD or they miss, then you can carry out your withdrawal the way you planned. And then if any of the hexes that you retreated into or through cost more than 1 movement point, at that point, for each hex that you enter, you have to determine how many more than 1 movement point it costs to enter that hex. So let's say this one would be going through a gully and over a stream, so that's +2. So that would cost +2. You would make a UDD roll and add that +2, that added cost, to the UDD roll. If you fail, you are automatically disordered, and that stops your withdrawal movement. So if you plan to do 2, you fail your UDD because you moved into a expensive hex for the first hex, you would be disordered and you would not even attempt to move into the second hex. So you would stop there and you would be disordered. Also, if the withdrawal fire disordered you, you can still uh, move into the first hex, even if it's clear and you don't have to undertake an additional UDD. But because you're disordered, you would stop right away. If you're disordered at any point during a withdrawal, you stop after the first hex. That is withdrawal movement, which is technically not movement, but it is, you could just call it withdrawal. That would be more accurate and less confusing. Okay. Other things that movement is not are reactions to combat results. So a retreat, although it changes your proximity and your position on the map, is not movement per se. It is a retreat. So if you've got a unit here and he fires at you, let's say the Confederates are phasing now. He fires at you, you fail your UDD, and you're already disordered. What that means in terms of the combat rules is that you lose a strength point and you retreat at your option 1 or 2 hexes. So what you would do is, let's see if I have victory strength point markers. Okay. So fires at you, you fail your UDD, you would retreat and lose a strength point down to 7. That is a retreat. It's not considered movement. So the ramifications of that are, we know that if enemy artillery is somewhere around, let's put them in the town for now. Let's say enemy artillery are here. We know that, and let's say you started here. Let's move that there. We know that if you move within 3 hexes of a enemy artillery unit, that enemy artillery unit can use approach fire. So if you're moving and you move here, he can fire at you once per brigade activation if he is active, if the Union unit is active. If in this case the Confederates are activated, he fires at you and forces you to retreat and you move here, that is within 2 hexes of the artillery unit. But the artillery unit cannot use approach fire. One, because approach fire is only used by inactive or non-phasing artillery units, and it is only in reaction to voluntary movement within 3 hexes and line of sight of said artillery. So neither of those are true for a retreating unit. So retreat is not considered movement. So retreat can be caused by a unit firing at you. It can be also retreat before shock. Let's say this unit completes its movement and declares a shock against this unit. This unit may elect not to stand, but to retreat before shock, 1 hex, and then he would have to roll a UDD and could possibly rout, but let's say he does not. There, if he were to retreat there before shock, he would also still be within 3 hexes of a phasing artillery unit. He could not, the artillery unit could not fire at a retreating enemy unit. He can only fire at a phasing and advancing, phasing enemy unit that is active. So, retreats are not movement. Retreats before shock are not movement. They are what they are. Okay, so that's withdrawal movement. Now let's talk about reaction movement, which was also requested for this vehicle or for this stream. Let's clear all this. Okay. Reaction movement can be undertaken by 2 classes of units in reaction to what the phasing enemy is doing. And this is different than reaction phasing. Let's talk about that first. Okay. We know, let's first clean this unit up. them back into good order. And let's move them back here, and let's say form a nice union line here. Put the artillery in with them. Okay. Let's say the Confederates are trying to move the Union off of the side of this hill here. They've got a nice line here, and with this position, they could just try to charge straight ahead, but I'm sure you're also seeing already here that the smart move might be to move this unit here onto the flank of this unit. Seems the best way to go. You get a fire bonus for firing into a flank. You don't get any return fire because the unit is now pinned. And here are his two frontal hexes, not that hex out off to the side. So that all makes sense. However, once you undertake that movement, once you enter this hex, this unit has the option to try and do a reaction facing. If he does that, he can say, okay, I'm going to react so that this unit's not flanking me. And then he has to roll a UDD, which if he fails, he is disordered. So I rolled a 1. So that he could do that without any penalty. So basically, he would have seen this unit coming up the hill there, would realize, oh, they're trying to flank us, and then they kind of change their facing almost even before the enemy get there. On the other hand, if I roll too high, then I'm going to be disordered, and that could have other bad effects, like say this unit here ends up here, and because he is under attack orders, let's change Wharton's to attack orders. If he's under attack orders, he could both move there and then decide to fire. If he fires now, he's firing at a disordered unit. So if he gets one more disorder as a result, he can back those units out of there. Also, if he decides to later shock, that puts a little bit more heat on this unit because if they fail their pre-shock cohesion check, they could rout. All right. Now, let's change things up a little bit. Let's change these units back to good order. Move him back here. Okay. That is reaction facing. Also, if a enemy unit moves adjacent to one of your units, you can reaction face unless you're already pinned by the presence of another unit. So to go to our earlier example, let's say the 30th Virginia is here and has gotten there previously. He's pinning these two units. So now if this guy moves up on their flank, they cannot change facing to face this unit because they are pinned by this unit. So those are things to keep in mind when you're maneuvering. The order in which you maneuver your regiments does sometimes make a big difference. Okay, so reaction facing is also not movement. Neither is, say, a retreat that might be caused by failing a UDD for a reaction facing. Anything caused by that is not movement either. It's retreat. So you got to kind of keep your terms straight there. Now, let's talk about reaction movement for artillery. There are two classes that can use reaction movement. One is artillery and one is cavalry. Let's talk about artillery first. As we talked about a little bit earlier, artillery have two types of reactions that other units do not have. One of them is approach fire, which we talked about here, where any phasing unit that moves within 3 hexes and line of sight and the frontal hexes of an artillery battery may be subject to approach fire. The other thing that a enemy artillery battery can make use of is, let's move them back here, is reaction movement. And that's similar to withdrawal fire, only there's no adjacent enemy unit. This is presumably used to keep artillery at a healthy distance so that they can use their range as a weapon. So it's always easier to shoot when you're not being shot at. So artillery have the option that whenever an enemy unit moves within 3 hexes, that would be at this point, 1, 2, 3, they have the option to say, okay, we're going to skedaddle, and then they can move 1 or 2 hexes backward, subject to some restrictions. There are no facing changes. They cannot move closer to any other unit that is within 4 hexes and line of sight of them. So let's say for whatever reason the Confederates are also threatening back of that unit. They move within 3. If he moves here, he's now within 2 hexes of this unit, so he can't retreat there. He could move there because 3 would be the same distance as the enemy is trying to get to, so he could move that way. And then here, because that's also 3 hexes, he could retreat that way, but not that way because it's closer to this enemy unit. Okay. Also, the same restrictions apply to the reaction move that apply to withdrawal movement. That is, if any hex costs more than 1 movement point to enter, and for artillery, by default, that is any hex because artillery costs spend 2 movement points even to enter a clear hex. So for artillery, it's going to be in every case that they use reaction movement that the hexes are going to cost more than 1. So as they enter each hex, first you have to state, okay, I'm going to retreat once or 2 hexes, and you have to live with the result. So let's say, okay, we're going to move only 1 because we're artillery. So that's our plan, is to withdraw there. After we do that, we roll a UDD and we add 1 to it because 1 is 1 more than the 1 movement point you are allowed to withdraw freely, if not disordered. So you would roll, or you would enter that hex, which costs 2 movement points for artillery. So you would roll your UDD based on that with a +1, and I rolled another 1. So you could do that. Now, if you state that you're going to withdraw 1 hex, you couldn't say, okay, I passed, now I'm going to move a second. You have to state before you do the reaction move how many hexes you're going to attempt to move into. And then for each one that costs more than 1, you have to undertake your UDD roll. Artillery are limited to making one withdrawal attempt per brigade activation, enemy brigade activation. So if this unit moves in here and he says, I'm going to retreat one, and he goes there, this enemy unit can keep on coming to, he couldn't decide, all right, I'm going to move one more back. He has to live with that one. So the enemy can keep coming, and then he cannot reaction move anymore until the next Confederate brigade begins moving. Say these guys here from VMI or just another enemy brigade, in which case he could do a retreat once for those brigades as well. Okay, let's get that out of the way. Also, the second class of units that can use reaction are cavalry. Cavalry are a little brittle um, in the face of infantry, certainly. They tend to try and shy away from any artillery that are pointing tubes their direction. So they also have a skedaddle or withdrawal capability, even in the face of enemy cavalry. So if any enemy unit moves to within 3 hexes of them, they can choose to use reaction movement. And in addition, because they are lighter units on horseback, they can also continue to risk UDD movement as the enemy continue. So if this phasing unit here moves here, that's within 3, this unit can decide, oh, I'm going to skedaddle. Now, because each of those hexes only costs 1 movement point each, and this unit is in good order, they can do that. Won't cost them anything. They can do that in perpetuity. However, wait, let me check that. Yes, I believe. Let's see. Backwards. Reaction movement. Moving in reaction. Cavalry. Let's see. Moving reaction 1 or 2 hexes using the retreat rules. Because it is a non-phasing unit, there's no movement cost to do so. Okay. If it is complicated, though, by, say, having woods behind you, this unit moves here, and let's say your better move would be to go into woods, which costs, I believe, 4 movement points for cavalry, sometimes 3. Let's say it costs 3. That's 2 more than the 1 that they can move into freely. So they would have to take a UDD entering that hex with a +2. Let's roll. He rolls a 2, so he passes. So he could do that. If, say, he failed, he would flip to the disordered side, which lowers his cohesion. If the enemy keep coming, cavalry can attempt to retreat, reaction retreat again. But if they do that, they automatically lose 1 strength point per hex, no matter what. There's no UDD roll. They simply lose a strength point for each hex that they skedaddle afterwards. Let me again check that to make sure that that rule hasn't changed. I believe that is true. Let's see, moving in reaction. Failed UDD, second disorder results in the loss of a strength point or a gun. Okay. Okay. Failed UDD results in disorder. A second disorder results in the loss of a strength point or a gun. All right. And yep. Any failed UDD disorder or step loss limits the reaction move to 1 hex. So that is also true. Okay, and for cavalry, let's see if that has changed. It used to be just automatic that a disordered cavalry unit using reaction movement would simply not undergo an additional UDD. They would simply have to shed a strength point for every hex that they moved into, which for most cavalry units pretty much limits what you're going to try to do. It gets very expensive. Well, I believe that rule has changed. So they do undergo a UDD. They do get a chance to save themselves from losing an additional strength point, but um, that still does limit them to a 1 hex reaction, moving deeper into the woods. They would still have a +2 to that roll when they moved into there. So they rolled a 5 plus to a 7. That's greater than their cohesion. So at this point, they would start shedding strength points. Oops. Okay. So that pretty much sums up reaction movement. So remember that there are 2 classes of units that can use reaction movement, and those are artillery and cavalry, and they have special rules for how they can do that. And of course, the enemy can keep advancing and creating the same condition again. Artillery or cavalry can continue to retreat at their peril as the enemy advances. Artillery cannot. They only get 1 attempt per enemy brigade activation to try to retire by prolong, as it were. Okay, so I hope that clarifies things a bit about what movement is, what movement is not, and the types of other position changes that are not movement, but rather are retreat, reaction, um, retreat before shock, all of those other things that are different than voluntary movement. Okay, I hope that clears things up and doesn't further muddy the waters. This has been Stiglr here with another installment of Stiglr for the Details. We'll see you next time.